Well, now let's discuss PKI operations. PKI facilitates highly scalable trust relationships. Now recall that when we're working in a PKI or public key infrastructure, we're going to look to a trusted third party to provide authentication of our public keys that we'll use for encryption and authentication. The way that this PKI facilitates this scalable trust relationship is with a scaled CA hierarchy. So we can have certificate authorities and we can have authorities that sit underneath the primary CA server. The basis of the entire trust relationship in PKI lies with that public key of the certificate authority, because the CA server is going to sign everything. If we don't have that public key and it's not trusted, then we can't authenticate or decrypt anything that is signed by that CA server. Now, some CA public keys are going to come preloaded. And so if you were to open up your web browser and you were to go into your certificates, you would see several public keys from various certificate authorities that are listed there. However, if you are enrolling to get your own identity certificate from your local certificate authority, maybe one that's within your organization, in that case, you're likely going to have to install the public key of the CA manually as part of that enrollment process. So this is what it looks like to perform a certificate enrollment. So here we have a certificate request that's being generated by a web server. And that is being submitted to the CA. And however that's done could be through an automated process, through filling out a web form, could be a manual process that we might have to open up our certificate signing request, or CSR, that we're going to generate as a web server admin. We may have to open that request up, and we may have to copy the contents into a field and step through a process on the CA server. But what we want to have happen is we need to get a signed certificate that comes back from that CA server. Now, in many cases, that certificate will sit in a pending state. And while it's sitting in that pending state, a certificate admin is going to perform some type of authentication. Now, when we do this with a web server for a domain that we own, we can create a CNAME or submit a text file to our DNS, and then the CA server can validate that we own the domain by looking at our DNS configuration. But in some cases, this CA admin is going to use an out-of-band management, and in this case, we're using just a phone call. The CA admin is calling the web server admin, and they can verify the signature and make sure that this is a certificate enrollment that you intended. Now, once the CA admin approves, then the signed certificate can be delivered to the web server admin and installed. So that's the certificate enrollment process. Now, in addition to having that identity certificate, remember we needed to download the public key of the CA server. We call that the root certificate. So now here's what we have. We have two endpoints, Bob and Alice, and they want to talk to each other. And they're generating public and private key pairs. And that's how they're going to encrypt and authenticate traffic between the two of them. So in this case, we're being specific to the authentication that we're going to do using certificates. So Bob has his own private key, and he's got a certificate that he obtained from the CA server, and that is based on his public key. So there's his key pair, his private and his public key. So in the previous example, we enrolled with the CA server, and that's how we received this certificate. Now, Bob has a copy of the CA certificate, which has the CA's public key with it. We're not going to use that with our own certificate. What's going to happen is we're going to send our certificate over to Alice. Now, Alice is going to take that certificate and read the signature using the certificate from the CA that has the CA's public key. And once Alice can validate that your certificate is signed by someone that Alice trusts, well, now you are trusted by Alice. In turn, Alice has generated a private key and a public key, submitted that public key for authentication by the CA server, and received an identity certificate. And so Alice, too, is going to send Bob that certificate. Bob is then going to use the CA's public key to read and authenticate that certificate, that public key from Alice, is really who they say they are. And then at this point, we've authenticated both parties, and we now trust each other. At times, it does become necessary to revoke certificates. The certificates that are revoked are maintained in what's called a Certificate Revocation List, or a CRL. And each certificate has the URL of the CRL server or the OCSP server, and we'll discuss the differences between the two of those. And so what happens is, let's say that Alice is going to verify Bob's certificate. So Alice is going to talk to the OCSP server, or Alice has downloaded the list of revoked certificates at a set interval. That's a poll with the CRL, or it's a real-time query with OCSP. And we're going to query for the serial number on Bob's certificate. If we find that Bob's certificate is on that list, then we know that it's revoked and we don't trust him. Now, those two revocation check methods that we discussed there, first we had CRL. Now with CRL, or a certificate revocation list, this is a signed file from the CA, and it has just a list of all those serial numbers, and anybody that's in the PKI is going to poll that CRL. Anytime we update that CRL, there's a certain period of time before the CRL gets propagated to those in the PKI. So there is a period in time where an attacker could slip through a certificate that has actually been revoked, but we don't see that it's been revoked yet. Now, OCSP is an immediate push to the online database. And then anytime we check for validity, we query immediately. So OCSP overcomes that drawback of CRLs and that small period of time where an attacker could take advantage of a revoked certificate.